The morning Mamie Collins arrived in Dustcreek, Texas. The sky looked like a bruise, purple and yellow and swollen at the edges. And she arrived with nothing but a carpetbag, a name she had not spoken aloud in 2 years, and the particular kind of silence that settles into a person when grief has finished its loudest work and begun its quieter destruction. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Dustcreek sat at the edge of the Texas hill country like an afterthought someone had nailed to the earth with wooden storefronts and a single church steeple that leaned a little to the east, as if listening for something that never came. The main street was no more than packed red clay, ruts worn deep by wagon wheels, bordered by a dry goods store, a land office, a blacksmith's forge, a saloon with a green-painted door, a post office that doubled as a telegraph station, and at the far northern end, the livery stable that smelled of hay and leather and the warm breath of horses. Mamie stepped down from the stagecoach with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had learned that the ground beneath her feet could not always be trusted. She was 24 years old, though she looked at once older and younger than that, the way grief has of aging the eyes while leaving the face somehow untouched. Her hair was dark brown, the color of river water in shadow, pinned back tight beneath a gray traveling bonnet that had seen better days. Her dress was dark blue wool, too warm for the Texas spring, but all she had that was decent. She carried herself with a quietness that was not shyness, it was armor. She had come from Missouri, from a life that had been one thing and then, in the space of a single winter, had become entirely another. She had been a wife once, to a man named Thomas Collins, and before that she had been Mamie Bates, the schoolmaster's daughter from Calumet, Missouri, who read too many books and grew tomatoes and had a laugh that could fill a room. Thomas had been good. Not exciting, not wild, just good, with gentle hands and a reliable disposition, and she had loved him in the quiet way you love the things you believe will always be there. He died in the winter of 1876, thrown from a horse on a frozen road just 2 miles outside of town, and was buried in frozen ground before the year turned. And then the house went to his brother on account of debts she had not known existed, and the money was gone, and she was left with nothing but a surname that no longer attached to anything living and a name of her own that had stopped feeling like it belonged to her at all. She had stopped saying it, not as a decision exactly, more as a fading. The way a song goes quiet when you stop singing it. Thomas had always called her by her name, Mamie, he'd say, and it came out of his mouth like something warm and sure, and when he died, there was no one left who said it in the way that made her feel it was truly hers. His brother called her Mrs. Collins when he evicted her, formally and without malice, which was somehow worse. The neighbors said ma'am. The people on the stagecoach said nothing. She moved through the world like a woman who had misplaced the most important document of herself and could not remember where she'd last set it down. She had answered an advertisement. That was the plain truth of it. It had appeared in a Missouri newspaper in January of 1878, placed by a man in Dustcreek, Texas, seeking a housekeeper and cook for a working cattle ranch. Respectable position, fair wages, room and board provided. She had written a letter in her best hand, received a reply within 3 weeks, and bought a one-way ticket on the first coach heading south and west. She had not told herself this was a new beginning. She was too sensible for that kind of language. She had told herself only that she needed to eat, and that sleeping indoors was preferable to the alternative. The man who had placed the advertisement was named Harlan Price, and he met her at the stagecoach with a face like crumpled paper and a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second. He was in his 50s, a widower himself, with a cattle spread about 3 miles east of town called the Double P. He was not unkind, but he was not warm either, and he looked at Mamie the way a man looks at a piece of farm equipment he has purchased and hopes will function properly. He said, "You cook?" And she said, "Yes, sir." And that was the full extent of their acquaintance before he loaded her carpetbag onto his wagon and drove her out to the ranch. The Double P was a working cattle operation with a bunkhouse for 6 hands, a main house of 4 rooms, a cookhouse attached to the back, and a vegetable garden that had been allowed to go entirely to ruin. Mamie looked at the garden and felt something turn over in her chest, whether from grief or from recognition she could not have said. She set her carpetbag in the small room off the cookhouse that was to be hers, straightened her bonnet, and went to work. She cooked and she cleaned, and she was efficient and she was thorough, and she did not talk more than was necessary. The ranch hands were a rough lot but not unkind. There was a young Mexican boy named Rodrigo who was barely 18 and smiled at everything, and a red-faced man from Arkansas named Clem who always said grace too fast, and 2 brothers from Georgia, the Totem brothers, who were indistinguishable in temperament if not in height. And there was one other. She did not notice him straight away, which surprised her later, because he was not a man who blended easily into backgrounds. John Atkins was 28 years old and had worked the Double P for 2 seasons. He was from Tennessee originally, and he carried that origin in the rhythm of his speech, the unhurried quality of it, the way consonants landed soft and vowels ran a little long. He was tall and lean with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had likely never been described as anything but strong. He had steady brown eyes that watched the world with a quality Mamie would eventually identify as patience. Not the passive patience of a man who was simply slow, but the active patience of a man who had decided a long time ago that most things worth knowing took time to reveal themselves. The first time she properly noticed him was 3 days after her arrival, when she brought the midday meal out to the hands in the field, and he was the one who walked back to hold the basket while she poured the coffee. The other men took their food and moved off to find shade, the way men do when they are hungry and not inclined towards ceremony. But John Atkins stood there with the basket and said, "Ma'am, you need help getting back to the cookhouse." She looked at him. She said, "I can carry a basket." He said, "I know it. I meant the ground's uneven over by the south fence and you've got good shoes." She looked down at her shoes, her one good pair, black leather with small buttons at the ankle, and back up at him, and something in her expression must have shifted, because he did not push the matter further. He simply handed back the basket and touched the brim of his hat and went back to the cattle. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, without knowing why. The days at the Double P settled into a rhythm that was, if not comfortable, at least manageable. She rose before dawn, started the stove, made biscuits and coffee and whatever could be stretched across 6 working men's appetites. She cleaned. She managed the larder. She began slowly to resurrect the ruined garden, pulling up the dead growth, turning the soil, ordering seeds from the dry goods store in town when she rode in with Harlan on the supply wagon. The earth in the garden was good, she discovered, dark and loamy beneath all that neglect. Things would grow here if you let them. She spoke to the men as was necessary. She spoke to Harlan about supplies and menus. She spoke to Rodrigo sometimes because he spoke to her with such uncomplicated cheerfulness that it was hard not to respond. But she kept herself contained, the way she had learned to do. She moved through the days with the practiced efficiency of a woman who was managing and did not need anyone to notice. John Atkins noticed anyway. He did not make a production of it. He was not the kind of man who drew attention to his own perceptions. But she became aware, over those first weeks, of a quality of attention in him that was different from the other men's indifference or the young Rodrigo's breezy friendliness. When she came out with the meals, John was the one who made sure someone left a chair in the shade for her if the day was hot. When the cookhouse stove began making a worrying sound, it was John who came by in the evening without being asked and spent an hour looking at the flue. He said, "There's a block in it," and cleared it out with the particular competence of a man who has fixed 100 things in his life and doesn't need to be thanked for any of them. She thanked him anyway. He said, "It's nothing, ma'am," and went back to the bunkhouse. She did not think she was lonely. She had convinced herself that loneliness was a thing she had moved past, the way you move past a town on a long road. You see it behind you and you acknowledge that it exists, but you are not stopping there again." But John Atkins kept doing small things, quiet things, and each of those things made a small sound inside her that she had not heard in a very long time, and she did not know what to do with the sound. She made good biscuits. He told her so one morning in passing, and she said, "There's nothing special about them." And he said, "With respect, ma'am, that's not correct," and went out the door. And she stood in the cookhouse holding a biscuit pan and feeling, for just a moment, like a person who existed in some specific way in the world. It was in the 6th week of her time at the Double P that the something shifts began in earnest, beginning with a night that started ordinarily and turned into something else entirely. There had been a storm building all afternoon, the kind of big Texas storm that comes in off the plains like a moving wall, black at the base and green at the top, the air smelling of iron and rain and something electric. Harlan and the Totem brothers had ridden out to move the cattle away from the low pasture before the water came. Rodrigo was in the barn securing the horses. Clem was in the bunkhouse with a sore knee he'd earned falling from a fence post that morning. And Mamie was in the cookhouse when the wind hit the side of the building like a hand shoving hard against a door. She had the stove going and supper was on, and she was not particularly afraid of storms. But this one was large and moving fast, and when the first window shutter tore loose and began banging, she went out to catch it, and the rain was already coming down sideways, and the wind was strong enough to push her sideways across the yard. She got hold of the shutter and was fighting it back into place when a hand appeared beside hers, large and certain, and pressed the shutter flat against the wall while she worked the latch. She turned around in the rain, and John Atkins was there, water streaming off the brim of his hat, shirt already soaked through, holding the shutter steady as if the wind were a minor inconvenience. She got the latch secured. He let go. They stood there in the rain for a second, her hair coming loose from its pins, his face wet and composed, and he said, "You ought to get inside." She said, "So ought you." He said, "I'm going to check the roof on the cookhouse. Wind like this can pull shingles off." She went inside and toweled her hair dry and listened to him, moving above her on the roof for the next 20 minutes, while the storm broke itself against the land. When he came down and knocked at the cookhouse door, she opened it and he was soaked to the bone. She did not think about it. She said, "Sit down," and poured him coffee and put a plate of biscuits on the table, and he sat down, dripping onto the floor, and said, "Thank you, ma'am." They sat, she stood, at first, then sat across the table from him when the standing felt awkward, and they listened to the storm and drank their coffee. The cookhouse was warm and the storm was loud, and the lamplight was yellow and steady. She watched his hands around the coffee cup, the way they were calloused and work-dark but held the tin cup with a certain care, and she thought that she had not sat across from someone in the warm with coffee and a storm outside in a very long time. He said, "You been here long enough to see a Texas storm before," she said, "only from a distance." He said, "There's something up close." She said, "Yes." He looked at her not quickly, not intrusively, but with that patience of his, and said, "You're from Missouri." It was not a question, but she answered it. "Calumet, Missouri." "Yes," he nodded. "Long way." She said, "Yes." He said, "You like it here, the land, I mean." She thought about that honestly, which surprised her. "The light is different here," she said. "It comes in lower, there's more sky." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Tennessee light is different again. Softer, more trees to break it up, but I like the Texas sky," she said. "You've been here 2 years. 2 seasons of cattle work," he said. "Before that I came through New Mexico territory, worked a mine for about 8 months, decided that was no kind of life, came here. Before that, drifted a while after the war work was done." He said it without self-pity or drama, as a man recounts a trip he's taken. "Just geography." She said, "What war work?" He looked at his coffee. "I was too young for the war itself, barely. But after, there was a lot of unsettling that needed settling. I rode with a marshal's detail in Tennessee for a time. Reconstruction years. It was hard work." He paused. "There was a lot of injustice being done in those years, ma'am, and not enough men willing to stand between it and the people on the wrong end of it. I tried to be one of those men for a while. Whether I succeeded is another question." She looked at him properly, not the quick glances she'd been permitting herself. She said, "You're a decent man." He seemed almost surprised. He said, "I try to be." They sat in the storm in the warm of the cookhouse and talked for another half-hour, not about anything of great consequence: the cattle, the state of the garden, whether the dry goods store in Dustcreek was likely to carry what she needed for the garden seeds. But by the time the storm had moved on and the world outside was dark and dripping and quieted, something had changed in the air between them. Not dramatically, not the way things change in the instant of a kiss or a declaration. More the way the color of the sky changes between afternoon and evening, gradual, undeniable, irreversible. He stood to leave and said, "Good night, Mrs. Collins." And she said, "Good night, Mr. Atkins." She lay in bed that night listening to the drip of rain off the eaves and thought about his hands on the coffee cup, and the way he had said that the light in Tennessee was softer, and she thought, very clearly, with something that was more than surprise, "I'm not as finished as I believed." The weeks that followed were a slow unfolding, and they were not simple, because Mamie Collins was not a woman who moved toward anything without first calculating the distance and the cost. She watched him. She could not help it. She watched the way he handled the horses with that same steady patience he seemed to bring to everything, and the way he talked to Rodrigo, who was young and sometimes made mistakes, with a firmness that was not unkind. She watched him argue quietly with one of the Totem brothers about a fence line that needed fixing, and win the argument not by being louder but by being more correct. She watched him read in the evenings, which surprised her. A small, well-worn book he kept in his shirt pocket and read by the bunkhouse lamp when the day was done. One evening she was coming back from the garden, hands dirty, hair loosened from a long day's work, and he was sitting on the fence at the edge of the yard reading, and without looking up he said, "The tomato seedlings in the east corner are coming in well." She stopped. She said, "You've been looking at the garden." He looked up. "I walk past it on the way to the horse pasture every morning. Hard not to look," she said. "I didn't realize anyone was paying attention." He said, "Gardens are worth paying attention to." She looked at him sitting there on the fence with his book and the late golden light on his face and said, without really meaning to, "What are you reading?" He held the book out toward her. She came and took it. It was a collection of Shakespeare's histories, small and battered, the spine held together with what appeared to be a piece of bootlace. She looked at it and then at him with something she was not yet ready to call warmth, but which moved in that direction. She said, "Shakespeare." He said, "My mother's." She thought a person ought to have some acquaintance with the dead who had things to say. She handed it back. She said, "My father had 3 shelves of books in his parlor. I read most of them twice." He said, "What was your favorite?" She said, "Jane Eyre." He considered this. He said, "I haven't read that one." She said, "It's about a woman who takes a position as a governess and discovers that the man she works for is keeping a secret." She paused. "She leaves when she discovers the secret, but she comes back." He looked at her steadily. He said, "Does it end well?" She said, "Eventually, yes." Something passed between them in the gold of that late afternoon, in the space between the words they were saying and the words they were not yet saying. And Mamie felt it land in her chest like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for a very long time. She went inside before anything more could be said, and she stood in the cookhouse and pressed her dirty hands flat against the work table and breathed in and breathed out and thought, "This is dangerous and good, and I do not know what to do with either of those things." The danger came in a different form than she had anticipated, and from a different direction. In July of 1878, a man came to Dustcreek who had no business being in anyone's good story. His name was Del Rourke, and he came with 2 other men and a bad reputation that arrived slightly before he did, in the form of conversations at the saloon that Mamie overheard on one of her supply trips to town. Del Rourke was a landman. Not a lawyer, not a surveyor, not anything with a legitimate title, but the kind of man who acquired land by finding the weak points in people's situations and pressing on them. He had operated in Kansas and Oklahoma before drifting south into Texas. The weak point he had identified was Harlan Price. Harlan had debts. This was not unusual in 1878 Texas, where the cattle business had been contracting since the drive started declining, and the price per head was not what it had been. Mamie knew about the debts in the vague way you know about a thing when you work closely enough to a person to see their face when they come back from the bank. She had not asked. It was not her business. But she watched Harlan's face go harder and more closed in the weeks after Del Rourke arrived, and she watched Rourke come out to the ranch one afternoon in a good suit on a good horse and talk to Harlan by the corral for a long time, and she watched Harlan's hands grip the fence rail tight enough to whiten his knuckles. She was in the garden when John walked past on his way back from the horse pasture, and she said quietly, "What does that man want with the ranch?" John paused. His expression had gone careful. He said Rourke wants to buy it, below value. He's been doing it all across this part of the territory, acquiring land from men who are in financial difficulty, offering them just enough to get out from under their debt but not enough to start again. Mr. Price owes money to a bank in San Antonio, and Rourke has apparently bought up some of that debt. Mamie straightened from the garden and looked across the yard at where Rourke was still talking, smiling the kind of smile that has nothing warm behind it. She said, "That's wrong." John said, "Yes, ma'am." "It is," she said. "Is there anything to be done?" He looked at her. Something in his expression changed, a recognition, she thought later, of the fact that she was not asking out of idle concern but out of real thought. He said, "The land records are public. If Rourke has acquired debt illegally, or if any of the contracts have irregularities, it might be possible to challenge the sale. But that requires a lawyer and a degree of legal knowledge that I don't have." She said, "I know someone," and was surprised saying it to discover that she did. Her father's oldest friend had been a lawyer in Springfield, Missouri. A man named Alfred Bates, no relation but a family friend of long standing, who had written her 2 letters since Thomas's death expressing his condolences and his willingness to be of assistance if needed. She had not taken him up on it because she had not known how. But she knew his address, and she knew that Alfred Bates had spent 20 years dealing with land contracts, and she knew that he was a man of genuine moral fiber who would not ignore a letter describing what Del Rourke was doing. She wrote the letter that evening. It took her 3 drafts to get it right, to explain the situation clearly, to describe what she knew and what she suspected, to ask for guidance. She was precise about the relevant details and honest about the gaps in her knowledge. She signed it Mamie Collins and folded it and addressed it and took it to the post office the next morning on the supply wagon, and she told no one what she had done, except John. She told John because somehow, without quite deciding to, she had begun to tell him things. She found him by the barn that evening after supper, tending to one of the horses that had taken a small stone bruise on its foreleg, and she said, "I wrote to a lawyer in Missouri. About Rourke, about the land contracts." He was crouching by the horse's leg, working carefully with his hands, and he looked up at her. The barn was dim and warm and smelled of hay, and the horse shifted its weight and blew softly through its nose. He said, "You did," she said. "I knew someone who might be able to help, my father's friend. He does land law." He looked at her for a moment with that steady regard, and then he stood up and said, "That was a smart thing to do." She said, "Harlan hasn't asked for help. He might be angry when he finds out." John said, "He might be, but it was still the right thing to do." She said, "I don't know if it will work." He said, "It might not. But a letter costs nothing but time and effort, and you have more of both than most." They stood in the barn in the warm dimness with the horse between them and the smell of hay around them, and Mamie thought, "I trust this man." The thought was simple and enormous. She trusted him. She had not trusted anyone in 2 years in any way that reached deeper than the practical. And here she was trusting this man who read Shakespeare in the evenings and held coffee cups with care, and the ground did not feel unsafe under the weight of that trust. It felt solid. She said, "Why do you stay here, Mr. Atkins?" "At the Double P," he considered the question. He said, "The work is honest. The cattle are decent. Mr. Price is a fair man." He paused. "And more recently the cooking has improved considerably." She looked at him. He did not smile. He was not a man who smiled cheaply, but there was something in his expression that was close to a smile, the way the horizon is close to the sky. And she felt something move in her that she had not felt in a very long time, something bright and slightly unsteady, like a flame in a breeze. She said, "I should get back to the cookhouse," and he said, "Good night, Mrs. Collins," and she went, and the brightness moved with her all the way inside. August came down on Dustcreek like a weight. The heat was tremendous, the kind that flattened everything against the earth, that made even the light seem heavy. Mamie rose earlier to cook before the worst of the day and stayed later in the evenings working in the garden, because the evenings were cooler and the water in the cistern was sweet, and the tomatoes were coming in magnificently now, deep red and full, and she brought them into the cookhouse in baskets and sliced them with salt and pepper for the evening meal, and the men ate them without comment, which was the best possible compliment. John helped her carry the garden baskets without asking if she wanted the help, and without making anything ceremonial of the helping. He just appeared at the garden when she was finishing and took up the heavy basket and walked with her to the cookhouse, and they talked while they walked, about the weather, about the cattle market, about a book he had finished, and whether she had ever read Dickens. She had, extensively, David Copperfield twice. About the way the hill country looked in the heat shimmer, blue and wavering at the edges like something not quite real. They talked easily, without gaps that felt uncomfortable, and she noticed that she was not managing her words around him the way she managed them around everyone else. They fell out of her naturally, without calculation, and he received them without making her feel she had given too much. She noticed, around this time, that she had stopped calculating the distance to him. She noticed this on a day when he arrived at the cookhouse in the morning with a small wooden box he had made in the evenings at the bunkhouse. A seed box, carefully jointed, with small compartments for sorting and labeling garden seeds. He set it on the work table and said, "I thought it might be useful for the seeds you've been saving," and he was out the door before she could say more than thank you. She stood holding the little wooden box with its neat compartments, and she looked at the workmanship, careful, precise, done by a man who does not do things halfway. And she sat down quite suddenly at the work table and put her face in her hands, not crying, just feeling the full weight of what was happening to her. Because she had not expected to be a woman anything happened to anymore. She had finished that chapter, or believed she had. She had arrived in Dustcreek intending to be useful and efficient and unattached, and this man had made her a seed box. She collected herself. She straightened up and put the box on the shelf above the work table where she could see it, and she went on with the day. The letter from Alfred Bates arrived in the second week of August, and it was better than she had hoped. Alfred, bless his thorough soul, had done some digging through colleagues in Texas, and what he wrote back was detailed and legally precise. Del Ruerk had, in the course of his land acquisitions in Kansas, used contracts with language specifically designed to obscure the actual transfer of mineral rights alongside the surface land, which in 2 documented cases had been found to be fraudulent under the relevant state statutes. More significantly for Harlan Price, the debt that Ruerk claimed to have purchased from the San Antonio Bank had not been properly assigned. There was a procedural failure in the transfer documentation, which Alfred Bates was able to specify in the kind of language that made it actionable. Mamie read the letter twice, carefully. Then she put it in her apron pocket and thought about how to proceed. She did not go to Harlan alone. She went to John first, as she had begun to do with things that mattered. She found him repairing a section of fence in the east pasture in the late afternoon, the sun behind him and his hat pushed back on his head, and she walked out across the dry grass to where he was working and handed him the letter and watched him read it. He read it slowly and carefully, and when he was done, he read it again. Then he handed it back and said, "This is significant," she said. "Yes, I need to take it to Harlan," he said. "He may not take it well." "A man doesn't always want to be helped, especially by someone he didn't ask," she said. "I know that, but he will lose the ranch if nothing is done." John looked at her. The afternoon light was long and golden across the grass, and she could see him thinking, weighing it, arriving at the same place she had. He said, "You want me to come with you when you talk to him," she said. "I think it would help. He respects you," he said. "He respects the work. I don't know if that extends to my opinion on his financial affairs," she said. "I think it does." They went to Harlan that evening after supper. They sat at his kitchen table with the letter on the table between them, and Mamie explained it clearly and without condescension, the way her father had taught her to present information fact by fact, implication by implication, conclusion at the end. Harlan's face went through several colors in the course of the explanation, red, then pale, then something uncertain. He looked at the letter, he looked at Mamie, he looked at John. He said, "I didn't ask for anyone's interference in my business." John said, "No, sir, you didn't, but Mrs. Collins saw a problem and she had the means to do something about it. That's a hard thing to ignore when the problem is sitting right on your doorstep." Harlan looked at the letter again, long and hard. Then he said, "This lawyer, he's reliable," Mamie said. "He's one of the most careful men I have ever known." Harlan said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll write to him myself." He folded the letter with the meticulous care of a man who has just been handed something he is not sure whether to resent or treasure. He said, "Thank you, Mrs. Collins." She said, "You're welcome, Mr. Price." When they walked back across the yard in the dark, the stars were out in their full Texas abundance, 1,000 of them, more than Mamie had ever seen in Missouri, and John walked beside her and neither of them spoke for a while. Then he said, "You did a good thing." She said, "I hope it helps." He said, "It will," she said. "You can't know that." He said, "No, but I believe it." They stopped at the entrance to the cookhouse, and she turned to him in the dark and the starlight, and she could see the line of his face, the steadiness in it, and she thought, "Here is a man who believes things, who holds to things, who is present in the world in a particular and reliable way, the way the ground is present, solid under your feet when you have forgotten that solidity is possible." She said, "Good night, John." She had not said his given name before. It came out of her in a quiet voice, and when it did she felt something in herself shift, some small unlocking. He went very still for a moment. Then he said, "Good night, Mamie." She went inside and leaned against the closed door in the dark and breathed, her name in his voice, Mamie. It was the first time in 2 years that she had heard her own name said by someone who meant something to her, and it landed in her chest like something coming home. Not painful exactly, though there was a sting in it, more like the feeling of a numb hand beginning to come back to life. A tingling, spreading warmth, uncomfortable and wonderful together. She had not known how much she had missed it. Not just the name itself, but the person it belonged to, the Mamie who had existed before the winter of 1876, who had laughed and read books and grown tomatoes, and loved with her whole self. She had thought that person was gone. She had half decided to leave her behind, to be Mrs. Collins, who cooked well and managed a ranch kitchen, and did not ask for anything that could be taken away. But she had called him John, and he had called her Mamie, and she was not sure she could go back to the careful distances now. She did not try. September came cool and golden, and Dustcreek settled into the lower light of the season, and everything that had been building between Mamie Collins and John Atkins came toward a moment of reckoning, not in some dramatic way, but the way truth arrives when you have stopped trying to avoid it, quietly, directly, without fanfare. It was a Sunday evening. Harlan and the Totem brothers had gone to town for something. Rodrigo was in the barn. Clem was asleep with his hat over his face. The ranch was quiet in the way Sunday evenings are quiet. The week's work done, and the next week not yet started. A pause between two efforts. Mamie had finished clearing up after supper and was sitting in the garden in the last of the light, doing nothing, a rare luxury, just sitting on the old wooden crate she had put at the end of the garden beds and watching the tomato vines in the evening breeze. John came around the corner of the cookhouse and stopped when he saw her. He said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." she said. "You're not intruding." He looked at the garden, the neat rows, the full tomato vines, the little herbs she had started in pots along the south wall, the seedlings of fall vegetables coming up in the bed she had prepared last month. He said, "This is a real garden now." She said, "It wanted to be one. It just needed attention." He was quiet for a moment. Then he came and sat on the fence nearby, which was as close as he would sit without being invited closer, and they were both quiet in the garden in the evening light. A nighthawk called somewhere over the pasture. The air was cooler now than it had been, carrying the first real suggestion of autumn. He said, "Mamie." She looked at him. He said, "I want to say something and I want to say it right, so I'm asking you to let me get through it before you respond." She said, "All right." He looked at the garden, not at her, and said, "I've been in this territory for 2 years, and I've worked with good men and bad ones and a number somewhere in between, and I have generally been a person who keeps his own company and is not much troubled by not having more. That has been true for a long time." He paused. "And then you arrived here in April and started growing things, and you wrote a letter to save an old man's ranch out of sheer moral conviction, and you told me you liked Jane Eyre, and you called me John in the dark outside this cookhouse. And He stopped. He turned and looked at her directly, with an honesty so complete it was almost difficult to look at. "I'm a man who has not had a great deal of occasion for declarations, and I will not pretend to be graceful about this. But I would very much like to know if what I think is happening between us is something you are also, if you also," she said. "Yes." He stopped. She said, "I also." He looked at her for a long moment in the evening light, and she watched him absorb what she had said, the straightness of it, the simplicity. A man who valued honesty receiving an honest answer. And then something changed in his face, not dramatically, not the way faces change in the theatric gesture, but with a deep and private shift, the way water changes when the sun finally reaches it, something warming from the inside out. He said, "I would like to court you properly if you'd allow it. If that's, I know you've been on your own for a while, and I know this is not a conventional situation, and I'm not a man with grand prospects, but I am honest and I work hard and she said, "John." Quietly, "Yes." He breathed out. He said, "All right, yes." She said, "All right." They sat in the garden in the cooling evening, and the nighthawk called again and the first stars appeared. And it was nothing like the dramatic conclusion of a novel, but it was true. And Mamie thought that true was better than dramatic, and she was content with that completely. The courtship was not a secret exactly, but it was not announced. It simply became a thing that was known by Rodrigo, who grinned so wide about it that his face seemed insufficient for the expression. By Clem, who said nothing but began saving the best chair for Mamie at meal times. By the Totem brothers, who discussed it in low tones and then said nothing about it, as men sometimes do with things they privately approve of. Harlan Price observed it with the expression of a man who is slightly inconvenienced but not displeased, and he said nothing at all, which amounted, from Harlan, to enthusiastic endorsement. John came to the cookhouse in the evenings when the work was done, and they sat at the table with coffee, or when the evenings were warm enough. Outside on the bench Mamie had put against the south wall of the cookhouse, where the last of the day's warmth collected. They talked. They talked endlessly, about books and about land, and about the war years in Tennessee, and about Calumet, Missouri, and about what it meant to be a person who had lost their footing and found it again in an unexpected place. She told him about Thomas, the full truth of it, not with the removed, careful language she had used with others, but with the real texture of it, the good years and the sudden absence and the long, gray aftermath. He listened without trying to fix anything, which was what she needed. He told her about his years riding with the marshal's detail, the things he had seen in the Reconstruction South, the injustices that sat in him still like stones, and she listened with the full attention of a woman who understands that being witnessed in your history is one of the forms love takes. He held her hand for the first time on a warm September evening on the bench outside the cookhouse. Just her hand, clasped in both of his in the easy, natural way of something that has been building for months. She looked at their hands together and felt no alarm, no pulling back, no calculation of distance. She felt only the warmth of his hands and the rightness of the contact and a gratitude so thorough it nearly undid her. She said very quietly, "I had forgotten what this was like." He said, "So had I." She looked at him. He said, "I was not always alone by preference. There were years earlier when things did not work out as I'd hoped. I had learned to be solitary because it was simpler." He turned her hand over in his and looked at it with that focused attention. "You are the first person in a very long time who has made simple solitude feel like a loss rather than a choice," she said. "You are very honest," he said. "You seem to want that," she said. "I do. I have had enough of things that were presented as one thing and turned out to be another." He said, "That's a fair position," she said. "Tell me something else honest." He looked up at her. He said, "I think about you during the day when I'm working. I think about what you're likely to be doing, and I think about whether you're well, and I think about what you'll say in the evening, whether it will be practical or something that surprises me, and it surprises me a fair amount, which I find I like very much." She felt the warmth of that move through her entire chest. She said, "I think about you too." He said, "Do you?" she said. "I think about your hands on the coffee cup the first night of the storm. I don't know why that of all things." He said, "My hands are not remarkable," she said. "They are to me." They sat in the warm evening holding hands and being quiet, which was itself a remarkable kind of fullness. October brought the matter of Del Rurke to its conclusion, which arrived not dramatically but legally, which is how the best solutions to bad men arrive. Alfred Bates's correspondence had resulted in a letter from a San Antonio lawyer who was representing a challenge to the debt assignment, and Del Rurke, whose activities in Kansas had attracted the kind of official scrutiny that made a legal fight in Texas inadvisable, quietly withdrew from Dustcreek sometime in the second week of October, leaving behind nothing but some unpaid saloon bills and the memory of a smile that had nothing behind it. Harlan Price came to the cookhouse one evening and knocked on the door, which he had never done before, and when Mamie opened it he stood there with his hat in his hands in the posture of a man engaged in something difficult and said, "I owe you a debt, Mrs. Collins, and I don't say that lightly," she said. "You don't owe me anything. I saw a problem and I had a way to address it." He said, still. He turned his hat in his hands. "Your wages will reflect it." She said, "That's not necessary, Mr. Price." He said, "I know it isn't. I'm doing it anyway." He put his hat back on. "And for what it's worth, if you and Atkins were to, if there were to be circumstances in which you needed," he stopped, then tried again. "There's a piece of land east of the Double P's boundary that I own outright and have no current use for. It's about 80 acres with a spring-fed creek and decent soil. I mention it because I know a man like Atkins would want his own land eventually and the price would be right." Mamie looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That's very generous, Mr. Price." He said, "It's practical. I need a good foreman more than I need 80 acres. I'm not working." He turned to go, then stopped and said, without looking back, "You're a good woman, Mrs. Collins. I'm glad you answered that advertisement." He went back to the main house, and Mamie stood in the doorway and felt the October night air on her face and thought about 80 acres with a spring-fed creek and smiled in a way she had not smiled in a very long time. She told John about it that evening. He went very still. Then he said, "He offered you land," she said. "He offered it as something that might be relevant to circumstances. He was not specific." She paused. "He was specific enough." John was quiet for a long time. He said, "Mamie, I want to ask you something and I want to ask it properly," she said. "Then ask it." He said, "I don't have much. I have 2 horses and a good saddle and 4 years of wages saved, and that's about the sum of my material situation. I am not a wealthy prospect," she said. "I am a widow with a carpetbag and a seed box. I don't know that wealth is the central consideration." He said, "No, it isn't. The central consideration is this." He stopped and gathered himself, the way careful men do before they say the most important thing. "I love you, Mamie. I have been in the neighborhood of that feeling for most of the summer, and I am now thoroughly arrived. I am asking you to marry me, if you'd have me. Not because of land or practicality or any reason outside of the fact that you are the most present and honest and remarkable person I have ever sat across a table from, and the thought of this ranch, this whole territory, without you in it, is something I cannot entertain." Mamie looked at him. The lamplight was on his face, and his brown eyes were steady, and the feeling in her chest was so large and so warm that she thought she might need to sit down. She thought of Thomas, and she thought of the 2 gray years, and she thought of arriving in Dustcreek with a carpetbag and a name she had stopped using, and she thought of seed boxes and stormy evenings and a hand holding hers in the September warmth, and she thought, "I am Mamie Collins, and I am here, present in my own name, and here is a man who knows it and says it and means it." She said, "Yes, John, I will marry you." He let out a breath that seemed to have been held for some time. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. He said, "All right." She said, "All right." They sat for a moment in the warmth of the cookhouse holding hands, and not needing to fill the space with anything more, because what had been said was enough and was everything. The wedding was in November, a cool, bright Texas morning with a sky the color of a blue plate, and the cottonwood trees along the creek road shaking their last yellow leaves in a light wind. The ceremony was in Dustcreek's small church, which leaned to the east and always had, and the preacher was a thin man named Reverend Stokes who got through the words with genuine feeling. Rodrigo stood at the door of the church and grinned at everything. The Totem brothers sat in the second pew and were unexpectedly clean. Clem blew his nose twice. Harlan Price stood in the back and managed an expression that might, on certain faces, have been called proud. Mamie wore her best dress, which she had altered and pressed and trimmed with a bit of cream lace that the dry goods store had produced from some dusty back shelf when she explained what it was for. She carried a small bunch of late-season herbs from her garden tied with a ribbon. She had done her hair differently than usual, softer, looser, with a few dark curls at her temples. And when John saw her come down the short aisle of the church, he went so still that Rodrigo, standing behind him, had to suppress something that sounded very much like a laugh. John had put on his good jacket and had gotten his hair properly cut for the first time in some months, and he looked like a man who was taking something seriously and feeling the full weight and gift of that seriousness. When she reached him, he took her hand and he said, very quietly, just for her, "You look—" And then he stopped because the English language was apparently insufficient for the moment, and she felt that insufficiency as the finest possible compliment. Reverend Stokes said the words and they said theirs, simply and clearly and with the full weight of meaning behind each syllable, and when John slid the plain gold band onto her finger chosen from the jeweler in the next town, thin and fine and lasting, she felt the ring settle into place the way the right word settles into a sentence, exactly as it should, part of the whole. Afterward there was food and coffee in the churchyard. Mamie had spent 2 days cooking and been firmly prevented from carrying any of it by John and Rodrigo, and even, memorably, by one of the Totem brothers who had appeared in the cookhouse the morning before the wedding and said, "You're not supposed to be hauling things on your wedding eve," in a tone that brooked no argument. They stood in the November sunshine and ate, and someone produced a fiddle and there was music, and the yellow cottonwood leaves kept falling, and Mamie stood with her husband's hand in hers and felt, with a completeness that was almost staggering, that she was fully herself, fully present, in a life that was hers. She said his name and he turned and she looked at him and said, "I'm happy." He said, "So am I." He said it with a simplicity and conviction that went all the way down, and she believed him entirely. They moved into a small house at the edge of the Double P that winter. While plans were laid for what they would eventually build on the 80 acres, Harlan had sold them, at a price that was, as promised, well below the going rate, and which John paid for with his 4 years of savings and Mamie's raised wages, and the clean satisfaction of owning the ground beneath your feet. The small house was not grand: 2 rooms, a good stove, a porch that faced east to catch the morning sun. But Mamie had the seed box on the shelf above the kitchen table and herbs on the windowsill and John's Shakespeare on the small bookcase beside the door, and it was more than enough. It was, in fact, exactly sufficient, which is the best that can be said of a place in the world. John had spoken to Harlan about the foreman position, and Harlan had accepted the conversation with his customary brevity and given him the work, which meant better wages and the kind of authority over the ranch's daily operations that John had, for 2 years, been quietly exercising anyway. He was good at it. He was the kind of man who could tell a herd needed moving before the herd knew it, who could look at a fence line and see where it would fail before it did, who could manage other men with the low, steady authority of someone who has never needed to shout. The Totem brothers, who had regarded him with a neutral professional respect before, now regarded him with something closer to genuine admiration. Rodrigo called him boss with an intonation that made it clear it was not simply a title. Mamie kept the cookhouse, but differently now, not as a hired woman making herself invisible, but as someone with a particular domain and the confidence to operate it as such. She trained Rodrigo to help her with the cooking, which Rodrigo took to with the same uncomplicated enthusiasm he brought to everything. She expanded the garden over the winter, planning for spring. She wrote long letters to Alfred Bates, who had become, in the course of that year's correspondence, something like a renewed friend, and to a former schoolfellow in Missouri who had written when she heard about the wedding and whose letter had made Mamie sit at her kitchen table and cry with something that was not grief at all but its opposite, the accumulated feeling of a life returning to itself. Christmas of 1878 was the first Christmas in 3 years that Mamie had spent with someone who wanted her there. They spent it quietly, a long meal, a fire, John reading to her from the Shakespeare, which she found she loved more than she had expected because he read it well, giving it the weight it was due without being theatrical about it. He had found at the dry goods store a copy of Jane Eyre which he presented to her on Christmas morning wrapped in brown paper, and she opened it and held it and looked at him and did not say anything for a long moment. He said, "You mentioned it was your favorite," she said. "You remembered." He said, "I remember most things you say." She kissed him then, properly and without hesitation, which surprised neither of them, because by now nothing about what they felt for each other had any element of surprise in it. It was only deepening, the way a river deepens after the rains, broader and more present and more itself. January 1879 arrived cold and clear, and they began making serious plans for the 80 acres. John had spent months thinking about it with the methodical attention he brought to every considered undertaking, and what he proposed was practical and sound. A house first, modest but well built, positioned to take advantage of the creek and the natural shelter of a low ridge to the north. Then a small barn. Then the cattle operation, starting with a modest herd and expanding as the land proved itself. Mamie had her own additions to the plan, a proper kitchen garden, large enough to supply the household and then some, and a space in the plan for an orchard, peaches and apples, which she had grown in Missouri and which would take years to produce but which she was willing to wait for. She said, "Peach trees take 5 years to really produce." He said, "Then we should plant them in spring." She said, "We'll be waiting a long time." He said, "We'll be here." The quiet certainty of it, the calm assumption of a shared future. She held on to that sentence for days afterward, warming herself against it when the January cold came in hard. "We'll be here." Spring brought the groundbreaking for the new house on the 80 acres, which John and 2 hired carpenters from Dustcreek and the unfailingly helpful Rodrigo, who had by now become something like a younger brother to both of them, began building in March. Mamie was there most days, not to be supervisory, but because she wanted to see it rise. She wanted to watch the boards go up and the roof go on and the porch take shape, because it was her house, and she had earned the right to witness its creation. She was also, by that March, carrying their first child, a fact they had known since January and had kept quiet for the appropriate time before telling anyone. Harlan received the news with a nod and a comment about the bunkhouse bunks being available for the carpenters, which was both practical and, from Harlan, roughly equivalent to a speech of congratulations. Rodrigo said, "That is wonderful, Mrs. Atkins," with such genuine warmth that Mamie had to blink quickly to keep her composure. Even the Tatum brothers offered what they clearly believed were appropriate felicitations. Mamie was well through the pregnancy, as she was through most things, methodically, without complaint, with the practical attention of a woman who had read enough about things to understand what was happening to her body and was not going to be frightened by normal processes. John was not hovering, which she would have found stifling, but present in a particular way, with an awareness of her that manifested in practical consideration. He made sure there was always wood for the cookhouse stove. He carried the heavier things without making a ceremony of it. He checked that she had eaten properly when the work of the day made her forget. He sat with her in the evenings and put his hand on her swelling middle with an expression of quiet wonder that she found entirely disarming. He said one evening, "Are you afraid?" She said. "Of what specifically?" He said, "Any of it." She considered the question honestly. She said, "No. I was afraid after Thomas that the life I had expected was the only life possible and that I had lost it permanently. But I think I know now that life is more generous than that, more willing to offer second chances." She looked at him. "No, I'm not afraid. I'm grateful is not large enough a word." He said, "There are things in this world that don't have names large enough." She said, "Like what we have." He said, "Exactly like what we have." Their son was born in October of 1879, on a cool, clear night with a half-moon over the Texas hill country, and the peach trees they had planted in the spring, just beginning to show their second season's growth in the garden of the new house on the 80 acres. The midwife from Dustcreek, a competent and plain-spoken woman named Mrs. Garrity, presided over the birth with the efficiency of long practice, and John sat on the porch of the new house for the hours of the labor and did not pretend to be calm about it, which Mamie, through the wall, found obscurely comforting. The boy arrived red-faced and furious about his arrival, which Mamie thought was a promising sign of character. He was healthy and loud, and entirely himself from the first moment. John came in when Mrs. Garrity opened the bedroom door, and Mamie watched him cross the room and look down at the baby in her arms with an expression she had never seen on any face before. It was not like happiness exactly, because happiness was too light a word for it. It was more like the expression of a man who has been walking toward something for a long time and has now arrived and finds it even larger and more true than he had imagined. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and said, "Hello." The baby was not impressed by this greeting, but Mamie was. She said, "What shall we call him?" John said, "I was thinking about that. Would you want to use your father's name?" Her father's name had been Henry. Henry Bates, the schoolmaster from Calumet, Missouri, who had 3 shelves of books in his parlor and believed that a person ought to have some acquaintance with the things worth knowing. She said, "Henry," and felt the name settle into the room and into the life entirely right. He said, "Henry Atkins." She said, "Henry Atkins." The boy continued to be unimpressed by the whole proceeding, but they were very impressed by him, and that seemed to be the appropriate distribution of regard. The house on the 80 acres was everything they had planned, and some things they had not planned on. The creek was better than they had known, running clear and cold through the east edge of the property, even in August, and there was a grove of live oaks along the south boundary that made an excellent windbreak, and also made, in the late afternoon, the kind of shade that a person could sit in and feel the whole world slow down to something manageable. Mamie planted her kitchen garden large and her orchard carefully, and John built the barn with care and started the cattle operation modestly and watched it grow. By the end of 1880, they had 40 head and a reputation in the county for good stock, and a house that was full of the organized activity of 2 people who work well together and know it. Henry was walking by 12 months and talking, in his fashion, by 14, and showed a strong early interest in everything that was happening at all times, which meant he needed watching but was never dull. John carried him on his shoulders when he went to check the cattle, and Henry regarded the cows with a seriousness that John said he found encouraging. Mamie taught him the names of things in the garden as he grew, crouching beside him in the dirt with the particular pleasure of a woman who has always believed that a person ought to know the names of the things around them. She had concluded, profoundly happy. Not in the uncomplicated way of people who have never lost anything and therefore don't know what the alternative is, but in the thorough way of someone who has returned from a long absence from themselves and knows, with absolute clarity, what the return cost and what it is worth. She had come to Dustcreek with nothing and a name she had stopped saying, and she had found, in this particular piece of ground and this particular man, the ground under her feet and the sound of her own name in her own mouth, and those two things turned out to be, when you set them alongside each other, the full shape of a life. She said her name sometimes, on purpose, in the quiet of the morning before the household woke. She would stand at the kitchen window with her first cup of coffee, the Texas sky going pink and gold over the ridge to the east, and she would say it quietly to herself, Mamie, and feel it all the way through, its wholeness, its specific and particular belonging to her. It was not the same as the days before Thomas, and she was not trying to recover those days. It was its own thing, a new claim on an old name, made by a woman who had come through the long silences and arrived again at the sound of herself. John said it every day, her name, in the casual, unremarkable way of a man speaking to the person he loves best in the world, at the breakfast table and across the yard, and at the end of the day when she was in the garden and he came home from the cattle range, Mamie. And it arrived every time the same way, warm and sure, like something belonging to her that could not be taken. She had not known, 2 years ago, how much she needed to hear it in that voice. She had not known it was possible to be given your own name back. In the summer of 1881, they learned there was to be a second child, and this time the news was met with a particular kind of settled joy. Henry, who was not quite 2 and understood more than he was given credit for, sat in John's lap while they talked at the kitchen table and patted his father's arm in what appeared to be solidarity. Mamie laughed, which was a thing she now did easily and often, with the full clear sound of someone who has nothing to guard against. The land continued to prosper, and the peach trees continued to grow taller now, reaching toward their yield, and John hired a second ranch hand, a steady young man from New Mexico who reminded Mamie slightly of Rodrigo in his fundamental good nature. Rodrigo himself had, the previous year, gotten married to a woman from a ranch south of town, a marriage that Mamie and John attended with the deep pleasure of people who feel themselves partly responsible for a friend's happiness. And Rodrigo's wife, a small, quick-eyed woman named Pillar, became someone Mamie was glad to know. The community of Dustcreek was, by 1881, growing into something more substantial than it had been when Mamie arrived. There was a school now, a real one, not just a Sunday school, and a doctor who had come down from San Antonio and decided to stay. The green-painted saloon door had been replaced with a new one, dark red. The church steeple had been straightened. The land office did a steady business. The injustices did not disappear. They never disappeared entirely, and Mamie and John both knew this and said so to each other, because they were people who preferred honesty to comfort. But there were people in Dustcreek who pushed back against them, including a small group of ranchers who had begun meeting to discuss land rights and fair dealing and who had invited John to join, which he did, with the same quiet, careful conviction he brought to everything. He said, "Change is slow," she said, "but it moves." He said, "It moves when people push it," she said, "then keep pushing." He said, "So will you, knowing you," she said, "you know me very well." He said, "I intend to know you better," she said. "How much better is there to know?" he said. "I think a great deal. I look forward to finding out." Their daughter was born in January of 1882, on a cold, clear morning with frost on the grass outside and the live oaks rattling their dry leaves in a north wind. She arrived quieter than Henry had, which they learned quickly did not reflect a quieter temperament. She simply surveyed her situation before registering her objections. She was small and dark-haired like Mamie, and had John's eyes, that steady brown regard that made you feel seen in an entirely benign way. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, but because it suited her from the first moment, clear and strong, a name with weight. Henry, upon meeting his sister, offered her one of his wooden horses from the box of toys in his room, which was, everyone agreed, an excellent beginning. John held Clara the way he had held Henry, with that focused, tender attention, the quality of a man who understands that what he is holding is both fragile and enormous. And Mamie watched him from the bed and felt, with a clarity that went all the way down, that this was the full sum of what she had been traveling toward through all the years of loss and silence and gray mornings, and the long, careful recovery of herself. Not the house or the land or even the man himself, alone, but the whole of it, the name said aloud, the hand held in the garden, the seed box on the shelf, the peach trees growing toward their yield, the children with their specific particular faces, the man with his steady eyes who called her by her name every day as if it were the most natural thing in the world, which it was, which it had always been, which she had simply needed time and space and the right voice to believe again. She said, "I would like to go to the garden today when I'm able." He said, "The peaches are starting." She looked at him. "Starting," he said. "I checked this morning. There's fruit coming." "Small still, but there," she said. 5 years. He said, "We're here." She said, "We are." Henry appeared in the doorway in his small boots and his oversized hat and said, "Papa, are there eggs?" With the directness of a 2-year-old who does not see why hunger should wait on sentiment, and John stood and carried Clara to the cradle and went to deal with the eggs, and Mamie lay in the warmth of the bed and listened to the domestic sounds of her house, her husband's voice, her son's small footsteps, the wind at the north wall, the fire in the kitchen stove, and she said her own name very quietly in the morning light. Mamie. Mamie Atkins now, who had once been Mamie Bates and had been Mamie Collins and had been, for 2 long years, no one in particular, unnamed and adrift, who had arrived in a bruise-colored morning at a small town in Texas with a carpetbag and a silence, who had planted things in dead ground and watched them grow, who had written a letter for a man who didn't ask and mended the unraveled edge of a ranch's story, who had sat in a garden in the evening light and said yes, and meant it with everything she had, who had been called by her name by a man who understood that a name is the most basic form of witness, and had said it back to him across the darkened yard and felt, in those 4 syllables of his name and her own, the full turn of something that had been locked for too long. Outside, the January morning was cold, and the peach trees in the orchard stood small and bare but not without their small tight buds, the promise of what was coming. In 5 years those trees would be heavy with fruit, golden and sweet, and she and John would pick them together in the summer heat while Henry and Clara ran between the rows, and she would put up jars and jars of preserves that would last all winter, rows of them on the pantry shelves, the color of summer caught and kept. And there would be years after that, more seasons of this good and ordinary abundance, more mornings with coffee at the kitchen window, more evenings with his hand finding hers, more conversations that went deep and easy as a river that has found its proper channel and moves now without effort or impediment, fully and freely itself. She knew this with the certainty of a woman who has learned, the hard way, to trust what is true. She knew it the way she knew the names of the tomato varieties, and the depth the peach roots would go, and the exact moment when bread is ready to come out of the oven through careful observation and earned experience, and the willingness to be present and paying attention, which is perhaps all that happiness really requires of a person. John came back through the bedroom door with Clara in his arms and Henry at his heels and said, Breakfast is when you're ready," and looked at her with that steady, quiet attention, and she said, "I'm ready," and meant it in all the ways it could be meant, ready for breakfast and for the day and for the years and for the entire enormous living continuation of a life that was hers, fully and truly, all the way down to its name. She sat up in the January morning in her house on her land with her family moving around her, and she was Mamie Atkins of Dustcreek, Texas, and she was entirely, completely, irreversibly herself, and the world beyond the frost-edged window was cold and clear and full of everything that was still to come.